Imagine you're at the Rucker tournament in Harlem, summer 1968. The crowd is three people deep on every sideline, hanging off fences, standing on car hoods, packed so tight you can barely breathe. The noise is deafening. And in the middle of all of it, this one guy, not the biggest, not the tallest, not the most physically imposing man on the court, is making professional basketball players look like they learned the game yesterday. Not role players, not end-of-bench guys, legitimate NBA talent, standing there looking confused, looking embarrassed, looking like they cannot figure out how this man just did what he just did, again, in front of everybody. The crowd loses its mind every single time. His name is Pee Wee Kirkland. He is already one of the most gifted basketball players alive. The Chicago Bulls will draft him the following year. He will never play a single minute for them. Not because of injury, not because the talent wasn't real, but because when draft day came, Pee Wee Kirkland did the math, and the streets of Harlem were paying better than the NBA. So he put the letter in a drawer, went back to the corner, and kept building an empire that the league's front offices couldn't compete with. One of the greatest to ever touch a basketball, never played a professional game, and somehow, that's not even the most fascinating part of his story. Sit down. To understand Pee Wee Kirkland, you have to understand Harlem in the 1950s and 1960s, because Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a universe. Harlem was the cultural capital of Black America. The Harlem Renaissance had made it the intellectual and artistic center of Black life decades earlier. Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington, Zora Neale Hurston, all of them had moved through these streets. The Apollo Theater on 125th Street had launched more careers than any institution in Black music history. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. represented the district in Congress. Harlem had produced Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black politicians, Black artists of global significance. But Harlem in the post-war era was also a neighborhood in serious distress. The same forces that were hollowing out Black communities across urban America, discriminatory housing policy, disinvestment, the deliberate concentration of poverty, were at work in Harlem too. Middle-class Black families who could leave were leaving, pulled toward the suburbs by the same post-war prosperity that was reshaping white America, even if they faced discrimination every step of the way out. What remained was a Harlem of enormous cultural pride and genuine economic hardship existing side by side on the same blocks. Brilliant people with limited options, ambition with nowhere legitimate to go, and heroin. Heroin had hit Harlem like a plague in the late 1940s and 1950s, devastating a generation that had come back from World War II to find that the country they fought for still didn't consider them full citizens. The drug trade that grew to supply that addiction became one of the few underground economies offering real money to young Black men with hustle and nerve. Richard Kirkland grew up in the middle of all of it, and from the beginning, two things were immediately, undeniably clear about him. He could ball, and he was smart enough to run anything. Pee Wee Kirkland's basketball talent was the kind that makes witnesses sound like they're exaggerating even when they're telling the exact truth. He was not physically imposing by NBA standards, somewhere around 6 feet, slender. But what he could do with a basketball defied conventional physical logic. His handle was supernatural. His court vision was decades ahead of its time. His ability to create space, to read defenses, to find angles that other players literally could not see, placed him in a category that people who watched him still struggled to adequately describe. The runs he played in Harlem at the Rucker tournament, which is the most famous and important outdoor basketball competition in American history, became the stuff of living legend. The Rucker has always attracted NBA players. It was the arena where professional reputations were made or destroyed, where all-stars came to prove themselves in front of crowds that knew basketball as intimately as any audience on earth. Pee Wee Kirkland didn't just compete against those players, he embarrassed them, regularly, publicly, in front of crowds that packed the sidelines and climbed fences and hung from whatever they could reach to get a view. Stories from Rucker veterans, men who played alongside and against NBA talent for years, consistently placed Kirkland among the 2 or 3 most gifted players they ever witnessed. Not most gifted street players, most gifted players, period. He played at Norfolk State in college, where his talent was further documented against organized competition. Professional scouts noticed. The Chicago Bulls drafted him in 1969. He didn't go. The decision not to report to the Bulls is the hinge point of the entire Pee Wee Kirkland story, the moment everything could have gone differently. And understanding why he made that choice requires understanding what he had already built in Harlem by 1969. Pee Wee Kirkland had not been waiting for the NBA draft while sitting idle. By the time Chicago selected him, he was already operating a significant drug distribution enterprise on the streets of Harlem. He had moved into the heroin trade with the same intelligence and organizational instinct that made him extraordinary on the basketball court. He understood systems, he understood people, he understood how to build loyalty, how to manage operations, how to think several moves ahead of everyone else in the room. His operation grew steadily through the late 1960s into one of the more substantial independent drug enterprises in Harlem. The money was real, genuinely significant money, the kind that made an NBA rookie salary look almost quaint by comparison. In 1969, the average NBA salary was somewhere around $35,000 to $40,000. Kirkland, by multiple accounts, was clearing that in a week, sometimes more. That financial reality has to be taken seriously when we examine his decision to skip the Bulls. It wasn't simply that he loved the streets more than basketball, it was that the economic calculus at that specific moment was genuinely not obvious, at least not to a young man who had grown up in a world where legitimate institutions had consistently failed the people around him and where the underground economy was delivering results that the legitimate economy was not. That doesn't make it the right choice, but it makes it a more understandable one than the mythology sometimes allows. Kirkland also carried himself with a particular style that was distinctly Harlem, distinctly of the era. Sharp dresser, magnetic presence, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became the room's center of gravity, on a court, on a corner, anywhere. He was the full package of charisma that the streets and the game both rewarded in different ways. The New York that Pee Wee Kirkland was operating in through the late 1960s and early 1970s was a city in genuine crisis. And the heroin epidemic was both a symptom and an accelerant of that crisis. New York's fiscal situation was deteriorating badly through this period. The city would nearly go bankrupt entirely in 1975, a crisis so severe that the famous Daily News headline captured the federal government's initial refusal to provide a bailout. Municipal services were collapsing. The subway system was dangerous and decrepit. Entire neighborhoods in the Bronx were literally burning. Landlord arson for insurance money, abandonment, the physical infrastructure of communities collapsing in real time. Harlem was living all of it. The heroin trade thrived in exactly that environment, a community stripped of economic alternatives, institutional support, and any real sense that legitimate pathways existed or were accessible. The numbers of addicted New Yorkers in this era were staggering. Entire blocks, entire buildings, entire families were consumed. Law enforcement's response was simultaneously brutal toward low-level offenders and largely ineffective against the organizational structures driving the trade. Governor Nelson Rockefeller in 1973 pushed through what became known as the Rockefeller drug laws, some of the harshest mandatory minimum drug sentencing legislation in American history. 15 years to life for possession of 4 ounces of narcotics. The laws were explicitly designed to be draconian, to use the threat of extreme sentencing as deterrence. What they actually did was fill New York's prisons disproportionately with Black and Latino men, shatter communities already under severe stress, and do essentially nothing to address the structural conditions driving drug use and trafficking. They are now widely regarded as one of the most catastrophic drug policy failures in American history, a consensus so strong that New York eventually reformed them significantly decades later. Pee Wee Kirkland was operating in that world, heading toward a collision with that legal apparatus. Federal investigators built a case against Kirkland's operation through the early 1970s. The charges were serious: federal narcotics conspiracy, the kind of organized drug trafficking case that carried substantial prison exposure, particularly in the Rockefeller era's atmosphere of maximalist drug prosecution. He was convicted. The sentence was significant. He served roughly 10 years in federal prison, a stretch that covered most of his 30s, the years when his basketball career, had he chosen it, would have been reaching its peak. Prison changed Kirkland in ways that he has spoken about directly and publicly in the decades since. The time forced a reckoning with the choices he had made, the path he had chosen over the one the basketball court had offered, the cost of what he had built and what it had cost others. He came out the other side with something that not everyone who goes into federal prison manages to find: genuine reflection and a redirected sense of purpose. Here's where the Pee Wee Kirkland story genuinely separates itself from almost every other narrative in this entire documentary series. He came home, and he went back to basketball, not to play for money or glory, but to give it away. Kirkland founded the School of Skills, a basketball program aimed specifically at young people in the communities he had once helped destroy. He became one of the most dedicated and respected youth basketball mentors in New York City, spending decades on courts across Harlem and beyond, teaching the game to generations of kids who might otherwise have faced the same choices he had faced. He became a vocal, unflinching speaker about his own story, not glamorizing it, not making it cool, but using it honestly as a teaching tool. He talked about what he had lost, what the streets had cost him, what the game could have given him and didn't because he chose wrong. The basketball community embraced him, not despite his story, but because of the fullness of it, the talent, the fall, and the genuine redemption. He became a fixture at Rucker Park events, a living connection between the golden era of New York street ball and the present. Documentaries were made about him. He has been profiled in major publications. His name in New York basketball circles carries weight that decades of absence from the professional game never diminished. He also worked as a youth counselor and motivational speaker, carrying his message into schools, community centers, and wherever young people who were facing the same fork in the road he had once faced might hear it. The conversation about Pee Wee Kirkland's basketball talent inevitably becomes a conversation about what could have been. And that conversation is genuinely painful if you let yourself sit in it. Players who competed against NBA talent at the Rucker and elsewhere consistently maintained that Kirkland belonged at the highest level, not as a marginal roster player, as a significant talent, someone who would have carved out a real professional career, and possibly much more, given his extraordinary feel for the game. We will never know exactly where his ceiling was because he never tested it in the arena that would have definitively answered the question. That's the tragedy embedded in the legend. But here's the thing about Pee Wee Kirkland that makes him more than just a cautionary tale about talent wasted. He didn't disappear. He didn't spend the rest of his life defined solely by what he chose and what he lost. He came back. He built something real with what remained. The School of Skills kids, the hundreds, maybe thousands of young people in New York who got something from Kirkland's time and attention and honesty, those are the counterledger to the damage his drug operation caused. It doesn't erase anything. Accountability doesn't work that way. But it's real and it matters. The story of Pee Wee Kirkland forces a question that American culture has never been fully comfortable sitting with. What do we do with extraordinary talent when it exists in conditions that make the wrong choices look more rational than the right ones? Kirkland wasn't a man without options. He had the NBA draft. He had a genuine ticket out through the game he loved and mastered. But he was also a young man shaped by Harlem in the 1960s, where the underground economy had delivered in ways the legitimate economy had not, where the men he respected and the world he knew ran on street logic rather than institutional logic. The system that produced those conditions, the redlining, the disinvestment, the deliberate narrowing of legitimate pathways for black men of his generation, doesn't get a pass just because Kirkland ultimately made a choice that cost him and others enormously. Both things are true simultaneously. What redeems the Pee Wee Kirkland story, what makes it different from simple tragedy, is that he understood all of this clearly enough eventually to say it out loud, to young people, on the same courts where he had once been the most gifted player anyone had ever seen. That's not nothing, that's actually everything. The Rucker tournament still runs every summer in Harlem. The courts at 155th Street and 8th Avenue have seen more raw talent, more basketball mythology, more genuine greatness than most arenas with roofs and million-dollar scoreboards. Pee Wee Kirkland's name still gets spoken there with reverence, as the one who could do things nobody else could do, as the one who chose wrong and then chose right again, as the one who came back. Three Guy got an orange jumpsuit and preached from it. Frank Matthews got on a plane and vanished. The Chambers brothers watched their cash rot in bags. Jerry Lewis Bay wrapped crime in a prayer rug. Pee Wee Kirkland picked up a basketball again. And in a story full of men who never found their way back, that might be the most remarkable ending of all. If this one moved you, and it should, hit like and subscribe. Drop in the comments. Where do you rank Pee Wee Kirkland among the greatest who never made it to the league? And who do you want us to cover next?